I play this Fallout miniatures game, and to make my games more immersive, I'm recreating the Mall, one of the most iconic locations from Fallout 3, so that we can play one of the biggest games of Fallout Wasteland Warfare anyone has ever seen. In part 1, we got the foundations of this game board created, and we were ready to begin adding in some details, but just as I was about to get started on part 2, I ran into an issue. Alright, so here's the issue. I go on holidays for 1 week, in exactly 1 week's time. That's issue number 1. Issue number 2 is that we don't have all of the materials that I think we need in order to make meaningful progress on the board. So we're going to need to order those and hope that they get here in time to make changes to the board, improve it, and equally document and film all that before I need to go. Number 3, and this is potentially one of our biggest problems, I don't have a space to work on the board. In episode 1, part 1, I was assembling everything in our kitchen. That board was in our kitchen for quite a long time, and my wife's patience with the Mall has severely decreased, I know. We're going to need to move the Mall board from my office, where it's kind of being stored at the moment, back down into the kitchen, and hope that her patience is at an all-time high so that we don't get kicked out of the kitchen, in essence. So we've got 7 days to use up my wife's patience, thank you, and equally make enough progress on the board to warrant a new video. That is the goal. 7 days to... You're just gonna go to sleep. We need energy levels. There was no time to waste, so I haphazardly moved the board from my tiny office upstairs down into the kitchen and got my box of scrap foam from part 1. We'll be using these pieces to do all the building in this episode. If you're ever doing any terrain building at home, it really does help if you keep any scraps like this tucked away somewhere. It will save you a ton of money in the long run. From here, I started marking out with pen the main areas and sections of the Mall that I remembered from the photos that I took from the game. Things like sandbag emplacements and areas where the terrain changed in elevation. This wasn't a good idea, and I ended up losing quite a few hours to it. I got quite far into mapping it out and cutting out pieces of foam, and then when I had it assembled, it just didn't look right. This board isn't going to be a perfect one-to-one recreation of the Mall, but I want to try and keep it as close to the game as I can, so I went upstairs to boot up the game, walk around, and just visually map out the area in greater detail, and then went back downstairs again to map it out onto the foam. Okay, so I've gone back into Fallout 3 and amended my original view of what I think this should be. And I think we've got all the foam roughly assembled. So we've got the ramp coming in. We have the kidney bean, which is where they have some of the bridges that go across. We have the large sandbag emplacement here. The shielded turret goes here, and there's like a stairway that comes up into that. I actually thought it went round further, but it's not. This is just kind of vacant space, and the walls go down the end. This is what I'm calling a riser. This is just going to be a slab of dirt with another slab of dirt here. The walls come down. There's a walled enclosure type here. Sandbags across there with the ramp going out. So I'm happy with this. I think we have the broad strokes, the kind of the big items all in place. So what I want to do is, where we can, glue these in, glue these down to the board. And glue I did. The first thing I did was use my brown Gorilla Glue to stick all the main pieces of landscaping foam to the base. And once that was in place, I began creating all the little wooden supports that we see in the trenches and along the edges of the gun emplacements. For this, I took some craft sticks that I picked up on Amazon a while back and cut them down to size, and when deciding how long these strips should be, it genuinely just came down to the straight edges of the foam. If there was a nice straight edge, you can bet your bottom dollar I was going to stick a support structure to it. Before gluing the wood to the foam, I got a wire brush, scraped the wooden strips, and this really helps bring out the grain in the wood, makes them look a little bit more worn, but it is time intensive, and I was cutting so many of these strips. So as I started getting closer to my deadline, I kind of just stopped doing this, but it is helpful for you to know. That's a little trick for you to use on your projects at home. I glued these to the foam using my brown Gorilla Glue and my just standard Gorilla Super Glue. Now, 2 words of caution here. The brown glue will expand, so you'll see little yellow blobs around my board. That's the hardened, expanded Gorilla Glue. I don't mind this, as in most areas we'll be covering it up with modeling compound and little bits of flock, but don't be gluing your minis with this stuff. The other thing is that super glue melts foam, which I rediscovered when I melted the foam. Thankfully for this, it doesn't matter, and we'll just say that it created a stronger bond, but be careful of this when doing your own hobby projects at home. Gorilla Glue, the brown stuff, is fine. It's the normal standard super glue that will melt your foam. So honestly, I spent a few days measuring, cutting, and gluing these little wooden support structures to the game board, but in the end, I think they look really great, and I think it really helps show that the board is beginning to come together into what hopefully will be its final form. At this point, one of the tools I was waiting on finally arrived in the mail, a butane torch. And why is this important? Well, using a tool like a butane torch or a heat gun on the foam will melt it, as you would expect. That's helpful because with moderation, you can use it to create things like impact craters, weathering, or even smoothing out some edges of your board, which is what I used it for here in the trenches. With one evening left to work on the board, I got more of my offcuts and started placing in some details like the steps up to the gun turret here, as well as getting pieces of foam and shaping it around this offshoot at the back of the game board, and equally shaping it along the board edge as the ruined walls that sort of close off the trenches. We'll come back and weather and detail these later, but with only a few hours left in the clock to finish up, store the board away again, and get all the footage I needed for this video, my time was up. This board is really coming together in my eyes, and honestly I feel like a finish line is kind of in sight. Next time we'll be putting the modeling compound on the board, and we'll likely start painting the board as well, which is super exciting. This kind of project though is only possible thanks to the support of my patrons. So if you think this is a cool project and you'd like to support me in creating it, you can find a link to my Patreon down in the video description or in the pinned comments. If you want to check out the next step in this build though, you can click here. Or if you want to find out more about the Fallout miniatures game I'm building this for, you can click here.